Wyoming Territory, 1873. Ravens Creek was the kind of frontier town where folks minded their business and kept their troubles to themselves. The Dakota winter had been harsh, leaving the spring mud deep enough to swallow a man's boot hole. In this unforgiving land, Ryan Aldridge believed one thing with absolute certainty: a man survived the frontier by standing alone. Trust was a luxury that got men killed, and attachment was a weakness he couldn't afford, not after watching his father die trying to protect their family homestead from raiders. At 25, Ryan had already spent 7 years writing for various outfits, never staying long enough to form connections. His lean, muscular frame and handsome face with its perpetual 5-day stubble had caught many a young woman's eye in saloons across 3 territories, but his green eyes remained distant, calculating. The silver-trimmed black Stetson he wore had become as much a part of him as the Colt .45 holstered at his hip, both tools of survival in a land that took more than it gave. On this particular April morning, Ryan guided his dappled gray stallion, Thunder, down Raven Creek's muddy Main Street. He'd signed on with the Circle M Ranch for the spring roundup, and his saddlebags carried 6 months' worth of wages. Most cowboys would head straight for the saloon, but Ryan had learned that sobriety kept a man alive. Instead, he was bound for Hanson's general store to replenish his supplies before moving on, always moving on. "You need to settle somewhere, son," old man Crandall had told him last autumn. Man wasn't meant to drift forever. Ryan had merely nodded, knowing the truth the old-timer couldn't see. Settling down meant becoming a target. The frontier didn't reward men who planted roots, it buried them. Thunder's hooves splashed through a puddle as they approached Hanson's store, and that's when Ryan noticed her. She sat on a bench outside the church, her slender shoulders hunched against the spring chill. Her dress, once fine blue calico, was worn at the edges but clean. She couldn't have been more than 22, with honey blonde hair pulled back in a simple bun. What struck Ryan was not just her beauty, though that was undeniable, but the dignified way she held herself despite her obvious circumstances. He might have ridden past, would have in any other town, but something made him rein in Thunder. Perhaps it was the way she stared down at her gloved hands, as if they held some answer she couldn't quite read. Or maybe it was the small carpet bag beside her, all her worldly possessions reduced to what could fit in that modest container. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat brim, "you waiting on someone?" She looked up and Ryan felt something shift inside him. Her eyes were the color of summer cornflowers, rimmed red from crying but clear and direct as she met his gaze. "No, sir," she replied, her voice soft but unwavering. "I'm afraid not." Ryan should have nodded and moved on. The woman's troubles weren't his concern. Yet he found himself swinging down from the saddle, boots sinking into the mud. "Name's Ryan Aldridge, just rode in with the Circle M outfit." He didn't know why he was introducing himself. He never introduced himself. "Katherine Ellis," she said, then hesitated before adding Mrs. Ellis. The wedding band on her finger caught the spring sunlight, a simple gold band that seemed too heavy for her delicate hand. "Your husband meeting you here?" Ryan asked, though something told him the answer already. Her eyes dropped. "My husband passed 6 weeks ago. Pneumonia took him quick." She twisted the ring. "We were heading to his brother's place in Oregon when he fell ill. By the time I buried him, the wagon train had moved on." Ryan shifted uncomfortably. This was precisely why he avoided entanglements. Death was the frontier's constant companion, leaving broken lives in its wake. This woman's tragedy was none of his affair. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said stiffly, preparing to remount. "Thank you." She straightened her shoulders. "I'm not seeking charity, Mr. Aldridge. I've asked at the hotel about work, but—" She trailed off. Ryan understood without her finishing. A young, attractive widow without connections was viewed with suspicion in small towns, too risky to employ at respectable establishments, leaving her few options, none of them savory. "When did you last eat, Mrs. Ellis?" The question came unbidden. Her silence was answer enough. Ryan surprised himself again. "I was just heading to get some supplies. Would you join me for a meal at the hotel dining room?" Seems the least a fellow traveler can offer. The hesitation in her eyes showed she understood what accepting might imply, but hunger won out. "That's very kind. I would appreciate a meal, Mr. Aldridge." Ryan tied Thunder to the hitching post and offered his arm with a formality that felt foreign to him. As Katherine Ellis placed her gloved hand lightly on his sleeve, he told himself this was just one meal, a simple kindness that would ease his conscience as he rode away from Ravens Creek tomorrow. He couldn't have known that this small act would change the course of 2 lives forever. The Prairie Rose Hotel dining room fell silent as Ryan escorted Katherine through the door. In a town where everyone knew everyone's business, a strange cowboy accompanying a young widow raised eyebrows. Ryan felt her tense beside him but kept his pace steady, guiding her to a corner table with his hand barely touching her elbow. "Don't mind them," he said quietly. "Frontier folks are starved for entertainment." A ghost of a smile touched her lips, and we're providing today's show. This simple observation, delivered with unexpected wit, caught Ryan off guard. Beneath her proper demeanor was a woman who saw the world clearly. Once seated, Katherine removed her gloves carefully, revealing hands that, while smooth and delicate, showed signs of hard work. Not a pampered city woman then, despite her refined speech. Ryan ordered generously, beefsteak, potatoes, fresh bread, and apple pie, noticing how she tried to mask her hunger as the food arrived. "Your husband," Ryan said, breaking the awkward silence. "What was his trade?" "James was a schoolteacher," she answered, cutting her steak into small, measured bites. "We married last year in Illinois." He had dreams of starting a school in Oregon Territory. Her voice carried no self-pity, just a matter-of-fact acceptance that impressed Ryan. "You're a long way from Illinois." 22 years old and already seen more of this country than I ever expected. She took a sip of water. "I was 18 when my parents died of fever, taught in the schoolhouse myself until I met James." Ryan listened as Katherine Ellis revealed fragments of her life between careful bites of food. She was educated, capable, and now completely alone in a world that offered little mercy to women without protection. "What will you do now?" he asked finally. She set her fork down, meeting his eyes directly. "Survive, Mr. Aldridge. I still have James's brother's address in Oregon, if I can earn enough for stage passage west." "That's nearly 1,000 miles, Ryan interrupted, calculating the danger a woman traveling alone would face. "I'm aware of the distance. And his brother doesn't know you're coming." "No, James wrote to him before we left Illinois, but whether he received the letter," she shrugged slightly. "I have no choice but to try." Ryan should have wished her well and walked away. Katherine Ellis's future wasn't his problem. He had his own path to follow, the solitary trail that had kept him alive all these years. Instead, he heard himself say, "Mrs. Hanson, the storekeeper's wife, mentioned they're short-handed with their new baby. Might be worth asking if they need help." Hope flickered in her blue eyes. "That's very thoughtful. I'll inquire tomorrow." As they finished their meal, Ryan noticed the hotel manager watching them, his expression calculating. He recognized that look, the assessment of a woman's circumstances, the measuring of desperation. Katherine would need more than a single meal to establish herself here. "I've taken a room upstairs," Ryan found himself saying. "I'd be obliged if you'd allow me to pay for accommodations for you tonight. Separate rooms," he added quickly, seeing her expression. "Just until you can speak with Mrs. Hanson." Katherine stiffened. "Mr. Aldridge, while I appreciate your kindness, I cannot accept such an arrangement. It would ruin what little reputation I might establish here." Ryan leaned forward. "Mrs. Ellis, I understand your concern. But these are practical matters. You need safe lodging tonight." For a long moment she studied him, those cornflower eyes seeming to search for something in his face. Whatever she found there must have reassured her. "One night," she conceded. "And I will repay you once I've found employment." Ryan nodded, keeping his expression neutral, though something unfamiliar stirred in his chest. A strange sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. As he arranged for her room, carefully ensuring it was at the opposite end of the hall from his own, he told himself he was simply helping a stranger in need. The kind of basic decency any man might offer. What he couldn't explain was why, as he tipped his hat goodnight at her door, he found himself saying, "I'm riding out to the Circle M tomorrow, but I'll return in 3 days to check on your situation." Katherine's surprise mirrored his own. "That's not necessary, Mr. Aldridge." "Maybe not," he agreed, "but I'll do it all the same." As Ryan lay in his narrow bed that night, staring at the water-stained ceiling, he couldn't shake the image of Katherine Ellis's face, the quiet dignity in her features, the resilience behind her eyes. For the first time in years, he found himself thinking beyond his next ride, his next paycheck. It was dangerous thinking for a man who survived by staying detached. 3 days later, Ryan returned to town to find Katherine installed at Hanson's general store, efficiently organizing inventory while Mrs. Hanson tended her infant. The blue dress had been replaced by a serviceable brown one, probably second-hand, but her hair was neatly arranged and color had returned to her cheeks. "Mr. Aldridge," she greeted him with genuine pleasure. "I was hoping you might return." "Mrs. Ellis," he removed his hat, suddenly conscious of 3 days' trailed dust on his clothes. "I see you found employment." "Thanks to your suggestion." Mrs. Hanson was indeed in need of help. She lowered her voice. "They've offered me the room above the store in exchange for opening and closing each day." Ryan nodded, inexplicably pleased. "That's fortunate." "It is," she hesitated. "I've set aside money to repay your kindness." "Keep it," he said quickly, "for your journey west." Her blue eyes searched his face. "You still believe I should go to Oregon?" The question caught him off guard. "Isn't that your plan?" Before she could answer, Mrs. Hanson called from the back room, and Katherine excused herself. Ryan found himself lingering in the store far longer than necessary, purchasing items he didn't need and watching Katherine's graceful movements as she assisted other customers. Later, as spring stretched towards summer, Ryan discovered reasons to ride into Ravens Creek between his duties at the Circle M each visit. He found Katherine more settled, gradually winning the town's respect with her quiet competence and unfailing courtesy. Sometimes he'd escort her to Sunday dinner at the pastor's home, where her educated conversation impressed even the most skeptical townsfolk. "Why did you help me that day?" she asked him once as they walked back from church. "You could have ridden past like everyone else." Ryan considered the question seriously. "I've been alone a long time, Mrs. Ellis. Learned to recognize the look." "What look?" "Of someone used to standing on their own." She studied him then, really looked at him, in a way that made Ryan want to step back. "Is that why you never stay anywhere? Because you're used to standing alone?" "A man lives longer that way out here," he answered automatically. "Does he live better?" The question lingered between them, unanswered. Summer brought cattle drives and long absences, but Ryan found himself returning to Ravens Creek whenever possible. He told himself it was simple concern for a vulnerable woman, nothing more. Yet each time Katherine smiled at his approach, something loosened in his chest, a tightness he hadn't known he carried until it began to ease. One evening in late August, Ryan found Katherine sitting on the store's back porch, a letter in her hands. "News?" he asked, settling beside her on the step. "From James's brother in Oregon." She passed him the letter. "He welcomes me to join them but cautions the winter journey would be dangerous. Suggests I wait until spring." Ryan read the carefully penned words, noting the polite but distant tone. "Will you go?" Katherine gazed toward the distant mountains, gilded by sunset. "6 months ago I had no choice." Now she turned to him, her expression open. "Mr. Aldridge, Ryan, I find myself with options I never expected." His heart quickened at her use of his given name. "What options are those?" "The school board has approached me about teaching this winter. With my experience and James's training, they believe I'm qualified." Pride colored her voice. "It would mean having my own small house, the teacher's cottage, and a place in the community." "That sounds promising." Ryan kept his tone neutral, though something like disappointment stirred at the thought of her establishing permanent roots here, while he continued riding the range. "There's also this." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small brooch, a simple silver piece with a small pearl at its center. "Mrs. Hanson gave me this today. Said every proper lady needs something fine for church." "It suits you," Ryan said, noticing how the setting sun caught in her honey-blonde hair, now loosened from its day's confinement. "Ryan," Katherine said softly, "why do you keep returning to Ravens Creek?" The directness of her question startled him. In the months since their first meeting, they'd developed a friendship of sorts, but both had carefully avoided examining its nature. "I told you I'd make sure you were settled," he answered, avoiding her eyes. "That was months ago." Her voice remained gentle but insistent. "I've been settled since May." Ryan stood abruptly, stepping away from the porch into the yard. The truth was he didn't know how to answer her. His entire adult life had been built around avoiding attachment, moving on before connections could form, before loss could find him again. Yet here he was, riding 2 hours out of his way every week just to spend an hour in Katherine Ellis's company. "I should go," he said stiffly. "The foreman needs hands for the northern pasture tomorrow." Disappointment flickered across her face but was quickly masked. "Of course, safe riding, Mr. Aldridge." The return to formality stung more than it should have. Ryan nodded curtly and strode toward where Thunder waited. As he swung into the saddle, he glanced back to find Katherine still watching him, her slender figure silhouetted against the warm light spilling from the store's back door. For the first time in years, riding away felt like making a mistake. The autumn roundup kept Ryan away from Ravens Creek for nearly 3 weeks, the longest he'd been absent since spring. He told himself the distance was necessary, that he'd grown too accustomed to Katherine's company, too invested in her welfare. His life was on the range, moving with the seasons. Hers was taking root in town, their paths had crossed briefly, nothing more. Yet at night, lying under Wyoming's vast star canopy, Ryan found himself remembering details he should have forgotten. The way sunlight caught the gold flecks in Katherine's blue eyes, how her rare laugh transformed her face from pretty to radiant, the graceful movement of her hands as she arranged goods on Hanson's shelves. "You're mighty distracted lately," observed Charlie Weber, an older cowhand who'd been riding with Ryan since spring. "That widow in town still got you tied in knots." Ryan scowled. "Don't know what you're talking about." Charlie chuckled, stoking the campfire. "Son, I've been watching you ride into town every chance you get for months. Ain't hard to figure. She needed help getting established. That's all. And now she's established, so why are you still mooning over her like a lovesick calf?" Ryan stood abruptly. "I'm turning in." Charlie's voice followed him to his bedroll. "You know, some men spend their whole lives running from ghosts. Makes for a mighty lonely trail." The words echoed in Ryan's mind as he drifted into troubled sleep, dreams filled with images of his father falling during the raid that destroyed their homestead. Only in the dream, it was Katherine he failed to protect, Katherine whose blue eyes closed forever while he stood helpless. He woke before dawn, cold sweat on his skin despite the autumn chill. The dream left him shaken, reinforcing his conviction. Caring for others was a weakness he couldn't afford. Better to move on after the roundup, find work with another outfit far from Ravens Creek and its honey-haired widow. But fate had other plans. 4 days later, as the cowboys drove the herd toward the winter pastures, a sudden thunderstorm scattered the cattle. In the chaos that followed, Thunder stepped in a prairie dog hole, throwing Ryan hard against the rocky ground. The sickening crack of his leg breaking was followed by white-hot pain that stole his breath. Ryan fought to remain conscious as the ranch hand splinted his leg and loaded him into the supply wagon. The foreman's words drifted through his pain-hazed mind. "Taking you to town, doctor there, be laid up for weeks." Town meant Ravens Creek. It meant Katherine. The jostling journey left Ryan feverish and disoriented. He had fleeting impressions of being carried into a building, voices conferring overhead, then the sharp agony as the doctor reset his broken tibia. Through it all, one sensation anchored him, cool, gentle fingers stroking his forehead and a soft voice murmuring reassurance. When he finally surfaced from pain-induced delirium, Ryan found himself in an unfamiliar bed in a small, neat room. Sunlight streamed through chintz curtains, illuminating simple furnishings, a washstand, a rocking chair, a small bookshelf. Not the doctor's office or the hotel. Welcome back. Katherine sat in the rocking chair beside the bed, a book open in her lap. Her blonde hair was loosely braided over one shoulder, and she wore a simple blue house dress he hadn't seen before. Ryan struggled to sit up, grimacing as his leg protested. "Where am I?" "The teacher's cottage," she replied, setting aside her book to help adjust his pillows. "The doctor said you couldn't stay at his office and the hotel was full with cattle buyers. I offered my spare room." The implications crashed through his pain-fogged mind. "Katherine, your reputation is secure," she finished firmly. "Pastor Wilson's wife stays here during the day while I'm teaching. The arrangement has been approved by the school board, considering the emergency." Ryan sank back against the pillows, processing this information. "Teaching, you took the position." A smile brightened her face. "First day was last week, 12 students ages 6 to 16. She poured water from a pitcher and held the glass to his lips. "The doctor says you'll need at least 6 weeks before you can put weight on that leg. The Circle M has covered your medical expenses and left wages for your recovery." 6 weeks, the longest Ryan had stayed anywhere in 7 years. And here, of all places, in Katherine Ellis's home, dependent on her care. The vulnerability of his position made his chest tight with anxiety. "I should find other arrangements," he said, though even sitting up had exhausted him. Katherine's expression cooled. "Are you uncomfortable with my hospitality, Mr. Aldridge?" The return to formality stung. "No, it's not that. Then perhaps you object to being cared for by a widow. Or is it simply that accepting help contradicts your belief that a man must stand alone? Her directness left him speechless. Katherine sighed, her expression softening. Ryan, you rode into town every week for months to ensure my welfare. Allow me the same courtesy now that you're the one in need. Put that way, refusal seemed both ungrateful and hypocritical. Ryan nodded reluctantly, and the smile that illuminated her face was worth his discomfort. Good, she said, patting his hand. Now rest, I'll bring soup when you wake. As Katherine moved toward the door, Ryan noticed how naturally she belonged in this small home, her books on the shelves, a shawl draped over the rocking chair, wildflowers arranged in a mason jar on the windowsill. In the months since their first meeting, she had created a life for herself through determination and quiet dignity. And now, against all his instincts, Ryan found himself drawn into that life, not by choice but by circumstance that felt strangely like destiny. The weeks of recovery transformed Ryan in ways he hadn't anticipated. Initially restless and irritable, he gradually settled into the rhythm of Katherine's household. Mornings brought the sounds of her preparing for school, the soft clatter of dishes, the rustle of papers being gathered, sometimes humming as she pinned up her hair. By the third week, when he could move with crutches, she began leaving simple tasks for him. Vegetables to peel for dinner, kindling to split while seated, books that needed mending for her students. You don't have to keep me occupied like one of your pupils, he grumbled one afternoon, though secretly he appreciated the sense of usefulness. Katherine merely smiled. Would you prefer to stare at the walls all day, or perhaps count ceiling beams again? Her teasing surprised a laugh from him, a sound so unfamiliar that it momentarily startled them both. You should laugh more often, she observed, setting down a stack of essays to grade. It suits you. In the evenings, after Mrs. Wilson departed, they developed an easy domesticity that Ryan found increasingly difficult to resist. Katherine would read aloud from one of her books, Emerson, Thoreau, sometimes Shakespeare, while Ryan carved small wooden animals for her students. On Sundays, neighbors visited, bringing food and conversation, gradually including Ryan in the community's life. Folk are saying you might stay on after your leg heals, Charlie Weber commented during one such visit. Circle M would take you back come spring. Ryan glanced at Katherine, who was serving coffee to Pastor Wilson across the room. The thought of staying, of continuing this unexpected life, tugged at something deep within him, but old habits and fears weren't easily abandoned. Haven't decided, he answered noncommittally. Charlie studied him shrewdly. Sometimes, son, life offers second chances. Wise man recognizes them when they come. As October gave way to November, the first snow dusted Ravens Creek. Ryan's leg improved enough that he could walk short distances without crutches. With mobility came restlessness, and the knowledge that soon he would have no valid reason to remain in Katherine's home. The tension between them grew, unspoken questions hanging in the evening silence. Where would he go? What did he want? What did she expect? The breaking point came on a cold November evening when Katherine returned from school visibly troubled. What's wrong? Ryan asked, setting aside the leather bridle he'd been repairing. She hesitated before answering. I received another letter from James's brother. He's offered to send funds for my journey to Oregon after Christmas. She met Ryan's eyes directly. He also mentioned he has a neighbor, a widower with 2 small children, who has expressed interest in meeting me. The words hit Ryan like a physical blow. The possibility of Katherine leaving, of her building a life with another man, created a hollow ache in his chest he couldn't ignore. I see, he managed, struggling to keep his voice neutral. Will you go? That depends, she answered quietly. On what? On whether I have reason to stay. The directness of her statement hung between them. Ryan stood abruptly, ignoring the twinge in his healing leg, and moved to the window. Outside, snow fell in silent curtains, blanketing the small garden in white. Katherine, he began, his voice rough, I'm not the settling kind. Never have been. I know what you believe about yourself, she replied, moving to stand behind him. You think attachment is weakness, that caring for others makes you vulnerable. Ryan turned to face her, surprised by her insight. The frontier is unforgiving. I've seen what happens to men who let down their guard. And I've buried a husband at 22, Katherine countered. I understand loss, Ryan. But I also understand that a life without connection isn't really living, it's just surviving. Her words struck at the heart of the belief system he'd built since his father's death. What if she was right? What if his solitude wasn't strength but fear disguised as independence? I don't know how to stay in one place, he admitted. Don't know if I can. Katherine stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her blue eyes. Maybe you've never had sufficient reason before. Ryan's resolve wavered as he looked down at this remarkable woman, who had faced widowhood and destitution with courage, who had rebuilt her life through sheer determination, who saw through his carefully constructed barriers to the man beneath. What if I fail you? The question emerged from his deepest fear. What if you don't? She countered softly. The space between them disappeared as Ryan tentatively raised his hand to touch her cheek. Katherine's eyes fluttered closed at his touch, and something within him shifted irrevocably. Before he could reconsider, he lowered his lips to hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. Her response, immediate and certain, demolished the last of his resistance. As the kiss deepened, Ryan felt walls crumbling that had stood since boyhood, walls built of grief and fear and solitude. When they finally separated, breathless, Katherine's eyes held a question. I won't go to Oregon, she whispered, not unless you ask me to leave. Ryan shook his head, holding her gaze. I'm asking you to stay. I'm asking if there might be room in your life for a broken-down cowboy who's only now learning that strength sometimes means letting someone in. Her smile was radiant. I believe there might be. As the snow continued to fall outside the window, Ryan Aldridge confronted a startling truth. The safety he'd sought in solitude had been an illusion. Real safety and real life waited in the arms of the woman who had shown him that even on the harsh frontier, love wasn't weakness but the greatest strength of all. The news of Ryan Aldridge courting the widowed schoolteacher spread through Ravens Creek faster than wildfire through summer prairie grass. By Christmas, when he escorted Katherine to the town's holiday gathering, no one was surprised to see her wearing a simple silver band with a small pearl, the engagement ring he'd commissioned from the jeweler in Cheyenne. It matches your brooch, he'd said gruffly as he placed it on her finger, still uncomfortable with the open emotion that seemed to come so naturally to her. It's perfect, she'd whispered, tears brimming in her cornflower eyes. The winter passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Ryan formally accepted a permanent position with the Circle M, negotiating for a small parcel of land at the ranch's edge where he could build a home. Katherine continued teaching, though the school board reluctantly accepted that she would resign at term's end when she married. Will you miss it? Ryan asked one evening as they sat before the fire in her cottage, his arm around her shoulders. Teaching, yes, she admitted, but I can teach our own children someday, and perhaps tutor others when they need help. Our children, the words simultaneously terrified and exhilarated him. A family of his own, the very thing he'd convinced himself he could never have, would never risk. As April's thaw softened the land, Ryan's leg had healed completely. The day he mounted Thunder again was a revelation, not because riding felt so good, but because returning to Katherine afterward felt even better. The freedom of the open range no longer called to him as it once had. Instead, he found himself eager to complete each day's work and return to the woman whose love had rewritten everything he thought he knew about strength and survival. Their wedding took place on the first Saturday in May, 1874, almost exactly a year after their first meeting outside the church. Katherine wore a new dress of pale blue silk that matched her eyes, with wildflowers in her honey-blonde hair. Ryan, clean-shaven and uncomfortably formal in a new suit, found himself surrounded by people he now considered friends. Charlie Weber standing as his best man, the Hansons beaming approval, even the Circle M foreman attending with his family. As Katherine walked toward him on Pastor Wilson's arm, Ryan marveled at the journey that had brought them here. One small act of kindness to a homeless widow had somehow unlocked a future he'd never imagined possible, a future where connection wasn't weakness but the very foundation of a life worth living. Dearly beloved, the pastor began, but Ryan hardly heard the familiar words. He was lost in Katherine's eyes, in the promise they held, in the second chance neither of them had expected to find on the unforgiving frontier. When they spoke their vows, Ryan's voice remained steady, certain in a way he'd never been before. This wasn't the impulsive decision of a lovesick youth, but the considered choice of a man who had finally confronted his greatest fear and found it smaller than his capacity for love. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Pastor Wilson declared, and the small church erupted in cheers as Ryan kissed his bride. The celebration afterward at the Circle M Ranch house lasted well into the evening. As sunset painted the distant mountains gold, Ryan led Katherine away from the gathering to show her their future. The cabin he'd been building stood on a gentle rise overlooking a creek, small but sturdy, with windows facing east to catch the morning light she loved. "It's not finished inside," he apologized, leading her through the doorway, "but I wanted you to see it before everyone starts calling you Mrs. Aldridge." Catherine turned slowly in the main room, taking in the stone fireplace, the rough-hewn rafters, the plank flooring that still smelled of fresh-cut pine. "It's perfect," she whispered, moving to the window that framed the sunset-washed mountains. "Our home." Ryan stood behind her, arms encircling her waist, chin resting on her golden head. "I never thought I'd have this," he admitted quietly. "A home, a wife. A future that wasn't just about surviving until the next season." Catherine turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face. A face that had softened over the months, the habitual wariness replaced by something approaching contentment. "Do you remember what you said when we first met?" she asked. "That you recognized me because I looked like someone used to standing alone." Ryan nodded, remembering that fateful day outside the church. "We never have to stand alone again," she said simply. "That's what this means, this ring, this cabin, this life we're building. Whatever comes, we face it together." As darkness settled over the Wyoming frontier, Ryan Aldridge held his wife close, marveling at how completely his world had transformed in a single year. The man who had believed attachment was weakness now understood its true nature. Love wasn't a vulnerability to be avoided, but the very strength he'd been searching for all along. Outside their cabin door lay the vast, untamed wilderness that had shaped them both, Catherine through her loss and perseverance, Ryan through his solitude and caution. But inside these walls, they had created something the harsh frontier couldn't touch. A sanctuary built not of logs and nails, but of trust and second chances. The cowboy who believed he would always ride alone had finally found his way home. 10 years later, Ryan Aldridge stood on the porch of the expanded cabin, now a proper ranch house with 4 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and a covered veranda that wrapped around 3 sides. The Circle M brand still marked his cattle, but the raw-connected brand, his own, now adorned nearly 100 head grazing on land that bore his name. Papa, Papa. "Come quick," 8-year-old James Aldridge, named for the husband Catherine had lost, came running across the yard, his 7-year-old sister Rebecca following close behind. "The new foal is trying to stand." Ryan smiled at his son's excitement. "Is your mother down at the barn?" James nodded vigorously, his honey blonde hair, so like Catherine's, flopping with the movement. "She sent us to fetch you. Said this one's a special." Ryan took his children's hands, one in each of his calloused ones, and let them lead him toward the barn where Thunder's descendants now occupied half the stalls. As they approached, he saw Catherine standing in the doorway, their 2-year-old daughter Sarah perched on her hip, both watching something inside with rapt attention. At 32, Katherine Ellis Aldridge had only grown more beautiful to Ryan's eyes. Motherhood had softened her slender figure, and tiny lines had appeared at the corners of her eyes, signs of a decade filled with both laughter and worry. Her honey-blonde hair now held a few strands of silver, usually braided simply for practicality, but no less lovely for it. "Come see," she called, her voice still carrying that note of wonder that had first captivated him. "She's standing already." Inside the dim barn, a spindly-legged foal wobbled beside its mother, coal-black with a perfect white star on its forehead. As they watched, the newborn took several uncertain steps before collapsing back into the straw, only to struggle up again with determined dignity. "She doesn't give up easily," Ryan observed, slipping his arm around Catherine's waist. "Reminds me of someone I know," she replied, leaning into his embrace while keeping a watchful eye on their children, who had settled on a hay bale to observe the new arrival. Later that evening, after the children were tucked into bed with stories of frontier adventures, some from books, some from their parents' own experiences, Ryan and Catherine sat on the veranda, watching fireflies rise from the spring grass as twilight deepened. "Charlie Weber's passing got me thinking," Ryan said, referring to the funeral they'd attended the previous week for his old friend. "About legacies, about choices." Catherine's hand found his in the gathering darkness. "What kind of choices?" "If I'd ridden past the church that day," he said softly, "if I'd stuck to what I believed about keeping to myself, everything would be different." "You wouldn't have broken your leg," Catherine teased gently. "I wouldn't have found my heart," he corrected, bringing her hand to his lips. "Or these children, this home, this life that's more than I ever believed possible." Catherine was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Do you ever wonder about the woman I was then, sitting on that bench, not knowing what would happen next?" I think about her often, Ryan admitted, so young, so alone. So determined to survive without compromising who she was. She never imagined this, Katherine whispered, gesturing toward their home, the barn where new life had just begun, the distant lights of Ravens Creek where they were now respected citizens. Any of this. Neither did I, Ryan acknowledged, remembering the solitary cowboy he'd been, convinced that attachment was weakness, that caring for others would only lead to heartbreak. I thought I knew what strength was back then. And now, Katherine's voice held genuine curiosity. Ryan considered the decade they'd weathered together, the difficult births of their children, the seasons when drought threatened the herd, the winter illness that nearly took Rebecca, the joys and struggles of building something lasting on the unforgiving frontier. Now I know that real strength isn't about standing alone, he said finally. It's about finding someone worth standing beside, through whatever comes. As the first stars appeared above the Wyoming mountains, Ryan Aldridge drew his wife closer, gratitude washing through him for the small act of kindness that had changed everything. A meal offered to a homeless widow, a moment of connection that had somehow grown into a lifetime of love. On the vast frontier where survival once seemed to demand isolation, they had discovered the most enduring truth of all, that hearts, like homes, were built to be shared.